All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Kyle Lanslone Show. And I am very excited for today's episode because I have one of my favorite people in the movement here with me today to break down and go through some of the news, talk about the Trump administration. Dan McAdams, how you doing?
Hey, Kyle, thanks for having me on your program.
Of course. And for anybody who doesn't know Dan, which I'm sure he doesn't need an introduction, but just in case, you are the executive director at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity, where you do the Ron Paul Liberty Report, usually 4 days a week, sitting next to my hero, the man who really helped me to understand these concepts of non interventionism and liberty, prosperity, capitalism. And for many years, when he was on Capitol Hill giving those speeches I was watching, you were his foreign affairs advisor. And before that, you spent some time in Europe, including working as a journalist in Budapest. And so, Dan, I have quite a bit I want to talk to you about on today's show, but just kind of kicking off here, I'm wondering, we're now just 2.5 months or just about there into the Trump administration. And what are some of your early thoughts on President Trump? Is his foreign policy better or worse than you expected?
Well, if you had asked me that question 2 weeks ago, I would have had a very different answer, you know. And in fact, we had our conference down here in Lake Jackson last weekend, and I had prepared to give a talk that was very different than the talk I gave, because I was just going to talk about how thrilled I was, not necessarily by the foreign policy per se, but by, for example, the issue with USAID exposing exposing our foreign policy as a malicious and malevolent force rather than a force for good, and all of those things. But then and then he started. It started with the back and forth on Russia, the flip flopping on Russia, and that was getting tiring. You know, a lot of us, I'm sure you probably felt the same way, Kyle. You know, we wanted Trump to get in office and say, "Not my war. This is Biden and his team of neocons. I'm not going to go there. Wash my hands of it. It's done." That would have been the easiest thing to do. But he wasn't able to do that, apparently. And so it started with that. And then it moved into a kind of the ceasefire in Gaza, which was probably a ruse. And then that fell apart, i.e., the Israelis violated it, and Trump did nothing. It gave a green light to starting the slaughter again, and then the bombing in Yemen and the saber ratting toward Iran. So this, to me, is like all of a sudden he took a Biden pill and went on steroids, and so I think it's going off the rails pretty quick right now, in my opinion, and I hope that things change very quickly.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with you for all that. I believe you were on the Tom Woods show a couple weeks ago, and Tom asked you a similar question, and you gave a somewhat, I think, optimistic answer about Trump's foreign policy. And at the time, I agreed with you. I thought, I think Dan's right about that. And then the past couple weeks, I've really maybe start to rethink that. And in one of those cases, I think everybody who supported Trump somewhat understood or didn't necessarily expect Trump to have a better foreign policy when it came to Gaza than Joe Biden. But on the war in Ukraine, we're going to end it in a day. Okay, maybe that's campaign bluster, but still, we're wrapping this thing up. We're getting it over with. And I'm wondering what you think about Trump's prospects for ending the war in Ukraine at this point. I'm starting to lose some of my optimism here.
Yeah, he's sinking into the mire. He thinks he's going to micromanage a conflict that, frankly, he doesn't understand. And not only does he not understand it, his advisors don't understand it. They're fundamentally ignorant of the causes of the war. I think was it Witkoff who was on Tucker Carlson, couldn't name the four provinces in Ukraine that right now, at least, the four main issues. The provinces, I guess, they're Russia now. Didn't know the names of them. So when you have a team put together that's lacking some basic understanding. Plus, they've been fed on a steady diet of propaganda. The latest New York Times article being chief among that kind of information that is being processed by our foreign policy experts. When you're in that mire, it's kind of hard to breathe freely. And so I think that the only way out is to step out, and it's not going to be to make a deal. He doesn't understand why Russia is continuing this war, and if you don't understand why it started, then you sure as hell are not going to be able to figure out how to fix it, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. Now, when Trump came into office, one of the spots I was really concerned about when it came to the war in Ukraine was his ability to manage the Europeans and kind of not let the Europeans screw up his chance of ending the war in Ukraine. I have a couple clips here from some European leaders who have had some interesting statements in recent days, and I'm just wondering your thoughts. So let's play this first clip. This is from the European Commission President Ursula von der Linden.
We had a very good meeting of the Coalition of the Willing. The Coalition of the Willing has gotten bigger, stronger, and very determined. I've basically three key takeaways. The first was a broad discussion on how to step up in the support for Ukraine in the short term, financially and military-wise, the military needs that are there in Ukraine that have to be fulfilled, but also the financial needs. And here I can contribute that we will front load the EU part of the G7 loans for Ukraine. Second topic, keep up the pressure on Russia. It was very clear that the sanctions stay in place. What we want is a just and lasting peace agreement. That is the goal. And the third key takeaway was on the long-term support for Ukraine and our own European defense posture. Here, of course, the Readiness 2030 plan is crucial. It provides up to 800 billion euros of defense investment possibilities for the member states. And this means, for example, joint procurement with Ukraine in the European Union, but also in the Ukrainian defense industry. It's strengthening the defense industrial base of Ukraine. And of course, we need also a credible deterrence and defense posture in the European Union. And thus we have to develop our own defense industrial base too.
So, Dan, Russia is saying the West needs to end weapons shipments to Ukraine to take off the sanctions against Russia. And here is one of the top European officials saying that they're planning on doing the opposite. And I guess, do you think this could get in the way of Trump trying to make a deal with Russia?
Where are they going to get the weapons from? I mean, that's the big question. They don't have any manufacturing capabilities. We're out of weapons. We've already given pretty much everything we have to Ukraine. I mean, on the one hand, I'm cheering. That's great. If the Europeans take a look at Trump's reticence to support Ukraine in the way that Biden had and say, okay, we'll take the burden ourselves, that's fantastic. That's the best outcome. Go for it, guys. See how long that lasts. I mean, they're using, on the one hand, they're using this, and then they're gobbling up democracy on the other hand. You know, anyone who rises up in the political sphere who challenges this paradigm, boom, is unqualified to run for president. You know, you had Georgescu in Romania. You've had Le Pen in France now. There have been several others. So they're having to consume their own democracy while they're fighting for Ukraine's democracy. They're going to find themselves with a real wake-up call. This is the same von der Leyen who, at the very beginning of the war, when they passed maybe their first or second or fourth or whatever sanctions package, who declared that Russia's economy was in tatters. It's in tatters. And they've done nothing but grow. I think they had 4% GDP growth last year. So, you know, basically everything that she and the European Union have done have not harmed Russia. On the contrary. And so she's determined to continue doing what she has been doing. So God bless her. Good luck, Ursula. Keep it up.
Yeah, Dan, and one thing I wanted to ask you about is there seems to be a little bit of a phenomenon here where some of the more aggressive European countries are London, France, Germany, I guess the Baltic states too, but you also have some states that are in Eastern Europe, like Hungary, like Slovenia, who seem maybe a little bit less interested in waging this very aggressive war. And I guess I would assume that if a country were bordering Ukraine, that they would be the most concerned about Russia winning in Ukraine and the most aggressive, but that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case. So why do you have any insight onto why maybe the Hungarians aren't much more concerned about this?
Well, they've been skeptical from the very beginning. And I think there are a number of factors, but in Western Ukraine, Carpathia, it's called, is a region of Western Ukraine with a heavy ethnic Hungarian population that was carved out from Hungary after World War I at Trianon. It's a conference in France that ended World War I, and so Hungary lost a lot of people there, and the snatching people off the street, the draft in Ukraine has disproportionately affected that part. From the very beginning, disproportionately, we're sucking all the guys out from the west part of the country to go into Donbass and fight and get killed. And so I think that first raised, some of the red flags to Orban, the prime minister of Hungary. But I think as these things have gone down the road and he continues seeing people like von der Leyen making the same mistakes over and over again, I think he's more robustly established himself as head of the peace camp. He wants peace. And he wants to end the war, and the same is true with Fico in Slovakia. Who almost paid for that with his life. He was assassination attempt right after he was elected because he was not in favor of this war in Ukraine. So you're seeing more and more of this. And in Romania, the voters clearly want a different choice in Romania, and they're not allowed to have one. So there's a real bifurcation in Europe, and of course the Poles love to talk a good game. Sikorski, the foreign minister, loves to play the tough guy, but when it comes down to when the rubber hits the road, they just announced yesterday, oh no, we're not going to put any troops in. That's the last thing we want to do, and it wasn't because we'll get slaughtered. It was because that will just give Putin a PR win because he's been claiming we want part of Western Ukraine, so we won't want to give him that PR victory. Yeah, right. Yeah, tell me another one. And the Baltics have said the same thing. They're a three-man army between the three of them. They're not going to send those guys in either. And I think the same is true with Finland, which is stupidly inherited the longest border between a NATO state and Russia. They brought this upon themselves by joining NATO, where they always had reasonably good relations, certainly after World War II with Russia, considering the circumstances of the post World War II world. So, you do have these pockets, and I think they're expanding, and that's why the Ursulas of the world are getting more and more desperate. The Macrons of the world are getting more and more desperate. The Keir Starmers are getting more and more desperate, and you can see them lashing out. So I would put this on the plus column for Trump. He sees these people for what they are. I think he hates weak people, or people he perceives as being weak, and he sees them blustering and being very weak. And I think maybe it's just because he's a bully, but he wants to smack them down, and they deserve to be smacked down. So that's in the plus column for him. I think the way he's been handling Europe so far.
Yeah. So one question or comment, something I want to get your comment on, Dan, is now in Europe we have the coalition of the willing, and of course you were on Capitol Hill during the height of the war on terror, and we also have our Secretary of Department of Homeland Security Kristi Noem running around saying we're sending the worst to Guantanamo Bay, and she's taking pictures in that El Salvadorian prison that look more like something out of Abu Ghraib than anything that you should ever see. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are on this seeming rehabilitation of the slogans from the George W. Bush era, which I thought had all been thoroughly discredited and we all just naturally laughed at. Like, if you're the coalition of the willing, like, does that mean you're going to go fight a pointless war and spend a ton of money for no reason? Because that's what the first one did.
Yeah, well, that term lasted about 24 hours, and then they changed the term because nobody was willing. So they had to switch that. But again, go for it, guys. But do it without us. But as to these deportations, I think it was. I'm trying to remember her name. I think Spritz. Her name is Victoria Spritz. She's a member of the House of Representatives who said, I think it was yesterday, something, I don't remember the exact words. Basically, if you come in here and you're a gang member, you don't deserve any due process. We're just going to send you to El Salvador or something like this. It seems like there's kind of a mob mentality in the U.S. right now, and it's not just toward these supposed gang members who reportedly there's no such thing as these sort of indicative tattoos. I don't know much about it, but I know, obviously, Yeah, I support I support getting rid of people who are here illegally, and starting with those who commit crimes. That's no problem, and I think most Americans would think that's not a problem. But when you start scooping up hundreds of people and send them off to a foreign gulag without any due process at all, some of them are legally here. Then you got a big problem, and you've got a lot of red meat people standing up and down and clapping because they hate Biden so much for opening the border. It's just a sort of action reaction, and I think it's dangerous. I hate when I feel this mob mentality. We had it right after 9/11, and anyone who said, hey, why don't we tap the brakes here, you're with the terrorists. We had it in the frenzy up to the Iraq war, the same kind of thing. We're sensing it now, and it's dangerous. I think this one actually may be the most dangerous because there's this massive crackdown on the First Amendment is really coming to be a big problem.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Dan. And I think Dave Smith made a really good point on part of the problem recently when he said, Trump really came into office with this real mandate to execute a mass deportation program. And he is doing the kinds of things that are actually going to turn people against it. I'm not necessarily in favor or against a strong immigration policy. And like you said, you commit a crime, you get deported. That seems very reasonable to me, but you get sent back to your country of origin, not you know, war on terror era torture prison or some terrible El Salvadorian prison. You get sent back to the country that you came from, and and then there's some kind of due process involved. This is still the United States of America after all, but it seems like we're really eroding some of our Bill of Rights and our freedoms in order for Trump to execute this mass deportation plan.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, the Fifth Amendment is under siege. The First Amendment is under siege, and the people cheering it on, they don't understand, especially when in the First Amendment issue, the people that happen to be here and they may have written an op-ed saying that, well, maybe Israel shouldn't have slaughtered so many people in Gaza. Boom, she was praising Hamas, and therefore she's been sent to some prison in Louisiana. I mean, the people who are cheering that, they should stop for a second and think, because that can go around, and it's going to come around to Americans who are opposed to this administration's Israel policy. That's next. There's no question about it, because they've already dealt with people who are permanent legal residents here. So it'll be Americans next. And when a Biden or a Kamala or whoever comes next has that in his or her tool belt, man, can you imagine if you say something bad about a trans person, anything that's high on their agenda, the precedent has been set. I mean, it's just kind of depressing how stupid most people are.
Right. And I mean, especially with going after these people, these young college students who are supposed to be involved in the pro-Palestinian protest movement, is one of the reasons I find this so disturbing, Dan, is because if that same woman had wrote an article about the Houthis and about how Ansar Allah is a resistance movement against, the American colonization of the Middle East and against Saudi Arabia, I don't think she would be deported. If Mohammed Khalid had protested against Trump's immigration policy, I don't think he would be deported. I've seen a lot of people within the libertarian circle recently talk about how there's not supposed to be an Israeli exemption to the First Amendment, but that seems like what we have in place now.
If only he would have been burning an American flag, he would have been fine. That's no problem. But don't you dare say something negative about this other country. And I think it's backfiring, and I think Colonel McGregor was on the Judge's show a couple of days ago, and I think he really captured it well. I mean, Jewish people in America are going to see a real backlash because people don't like what they're seeing. They don't like the sense that there's one set of justice for this one group, and then everyone else is in a different set of justice. Trump thinks he's fighting anti-Semitism. He's actually creating a lot of anti-Semitism with these kinds of moves, and I think it's very, very dangerous. And more people are noticing, and it doesn't end well when these kinds of things happen. And what's next? I mean, there are tons of Jewish students that are doing way more than Khalid Muhammad or this woman did. They're very active. Jewish Voices for Peace. What are they going to deport them? Where does this end? It's insane.
Yeah. Well, I think the administration has even referred to the Jewish students as Hamas sympathizers, which is fairly disturbing. Now, I want to talk to you more about the Middle East, but I did have one more clip I want to play. This is Trump on Air Force One talking about his most recent conversation with Vladimir Putin.
Known him for a long time. We've always gotten along well, despite the Russia hoax. It's a hoax created by Clinton and Schiff and all of these lunatics. And that really was a dangerous point. That was a very dangerous thing they did to this country. It was a pure, unadulterated scam, hoax. But no, I think he'll be okay. But if he isn't, I was disappointed in a certain way. Some of the things that were said over the last day or two having to do with Zelensky, because when he considers Zelensky not credible, he's supposed to be making a deal with him, whether you like him or you don't like him. So I wasn't happy with that, but I think he's going to be good.
So, Dan, I want to get your thoughts on this clip. Just first want to tell everybody listening live, go ahead and share out the show. We have a pretty big audience right now. If anybody is over on YouTube, leave us a comment. If you got a question, maybe we'll try to take one or two of those. But Dan, what are your thoughts on this? Is this Donald Trump really moving away from negotiations? Is he just trying to reestablish himself as alpha dog? What do you think's going on here?
Well, literally within 24 hours of him saying this, he did another complete 180. So, I mean, he was PO'd at Trump for undermining the legitimacy of Zelensky, whereas a few days, a couple of weeks ago, Trump himself called him an unelected dictator. That kind of undermines you too. So the problem with Trump is that he's always repeating what the last person he spoke to says. And on this Air Force One trip, he had just finished playing golf with the president of Finland, who is an absolutely obsessive Russophobe. He hates Russia. And so my guess is during those 18 holes, this guy was filling Trump's ears full of Russia hate, and Trump's getting more and more PO'd. And so when he gets on the plane, he just kind of, spits some of that out, and then he goes back and, rethinks it and says, well, no, I basically don't listen to what I say. It's getting a little frustrating. It's getting a little bit tiring, I have to say.
Yeah, well, and we're only two months or so into this, Dan. We got 4 more years to go. Now, you have this recent article that originally ran at the Ron Paul Institute, and we did reprint it at antiwar.com because it's fantastic. And I think you have a really important insight into Donald Trump here. So I want to read this paragraph from you. You write, Trump has continued and perhaps even accelerated in his second term a pattern of extreme rhetorical escalation followed by retrenchment, possibly as a means of gaining attention of the party he's addressing. For example, he warned Russia earlier this month that he would increase sanctions and destroy its economy before breaking down to a series of lengthy phone calls and lately capitulating to all of Russia's demands. So is this a big bluff to get Tehran back to the negotiating the deal that Trump himself abrogated when he first took office? And so, Dan, I'm interested in your thoughts about this when it comes to the Middle East and when it comes to Iran, because I really do think you're right, where for all of Trump's bluster right now, I don't think he has any real intention to start a war with Iran. But at the same time, this is very concerning. So I'm curious of your thoughts.
Yeah, I think that the problem is he's surrounded himself by neocons. And there's one thing we know about neocons, and we heard it from, was it Tom Cotton just yesterday, said, everyone is talking about how hard it's going to be to fight Iran. It's not going to be a big deal. It's like, come on. We remember that from 2002. Every single one of the neocons, they lined up and said, it's going to be a cakewalk. It'll pay for itself. It'll be over in 48 hours, over and over again. This is what they do. This is their modus operandi. And sadly, unfortunately, because Trump doesn't have any people close to him who can be a counterbalance to neocon war siren songs, that he's got caught up in this loop. So he may not really want to, but the neocons are very good at ensnaring you. Oh, but Mr. President, don't you remember? You just said that that 2 months is up now. Remember? And, oh yeah, I guess I don't want to be looking weak. We got to do it. So it's a real problem, and the neocons are great at this, and it's a shame. that he doesn't. But it's also very dangerous because what may make him a successful businessman, a successful real estate developer, doesn't necessarily work on the world stage. I mentioned this on the show as well. I mean, if you're doing a real estate deal, you're going to exaggerate certain aspects. You're going to be, don't bust my chops, all this sort of thing, trying to get the best deal. You're going to bluff. You're going to do all kinds of things. But when you're dealing with countries who have to decide, is he going to attack us or is he not going to attack us? It's very dangerous. The Iranians might feel right now that with all the assets we've moved to Diego Garcia, that their best option is a preemptive strike. And that may well be if they believe what Trump is saying, which is something very, very bad is going to happen to them. So that's the problem with this kind of bluffing, that nobody really knows what you're going to do. Now, of course, you want to have some strategic ambiguity in your policy, but I think this is very, very different, and it runs a lot of risks, and it runs a lot of unnecessary risks.
Yeah. So, Dan, I hear everything that you're saying there, and I largely agree with a lot of it. Now, I did want to ask what you think about the chances are of. I think one of the real pickles that Trump has gotten himself in is it doesn't seem to me that there's any way he's going to get a better deal than Obama got in 2015. And Trump walked away from that deal in 2018 when Iran was complying with it. And so now, how is Trump, the ultimate deal maker, going to take a worse deal from Iran? I think, a lot of me thinks the best we could hope for the next 4 years is just rhetorical bluster exchange between the U.S. and Iran. We're not going to have a deal and just hope that we somehow avoid a war.
I think you're absolutely right, Kyle. I mean, it's preposterous to think. First of all, why would they want to even? How could they trust us in the first place? How can they trust Trump again to negotiate in good faith when they thought they had a deal with the U.S.? Indeed, they had a deal with the U.S. It had been approved by Congress, and Trump walks away from it. The same is true with Russia, for that matter. You had Minsk 1 and 2. You had all these agreements in place, and the U.S. and its Western partners walked away. I mean, we're not an honest broker, and we're not a good negotiating partner any longer. So I don't know what Trump thinks he's going to do to get Iran to give up more than it had. But I don't see that happening. And first of all Iran has to do is look around in the region. Look what's happened to Lebanon. Look what's happened to Syria. Look what's happened to Iraq? That's obviously on the menu for them. Who on earth, who in his right mind would accept that? If you're not already supine, and bombed to smithereens, no one's going to accept that.
Yeah. Well, along those lines, somebody from the audience asked a question of what do you think, if the U.S. does end up going to war in Iran, would that have any impacts on the negotiations to end the war in Ukraine? Do you see any connection between the two?
Oh, absolutely, because Iran, I mean, I don't think, if you'd ask me, is Russia going to come to Iran's defense militarily? I don't think so. I would doubt it very much. There are things that Russia could do to help Iran. They may help it with weapons. I mean, they may give the U.S. a taste of its own medicine, and give them some things that they may need to use. But nevertheless, they're not going to sit by and watch. Russia's not going to sit by idly and watch years now of its improving relations with Iran and the rest of the global South be blown to smithereens. I just don't think that's going to happen. And in fact, Russia concluded, it's not quite a treaty, but it certainly is an agreement to tighten the cooperation between the two countries. It's not a mutual defense treaty, but it's moving in that direction. So I don't see how Russia, knowing that it's also in the crosshairs, certainly of the neocons, would sit idly by and watch the dismantling of Iran. Now they basically did that for Syria, but there are a lot of very complicated factors involved in Syria that are probably too much in the weeds for our discussion right now. So I don't think that is a precedent to how they will react if Iran is attacked by the US.
Right. And, it's important to remember, Dan, and again, we don't want to get too much. Russia did help Assad for almost a full decade. And so if they gave that kind of support to Iran, it could be a much different scenario. Iran could win the war outright over the course of that decade. Now, earlier you referenced a clip from Tom Cotton, and I actually had that one queued up because I had to ask you about it. So let's let the audience hear this clip from Tom Cotton, one of the worst people on Capitol Hill.
And finally, there's some hysteria about the prospect of the president ordering these strikes, or someone like you in uniform providing him advice, that it's going to lead to another forever war or another endless war. Are you aware of operations, maybe operations against Iran, like the tanker wars in 1988, in which the forceful but discriminate application of military power did not lead to a forever war or an endless war, but rather led to peace and stability?
Yes, sir. Those examples in our history do exist.
Maybe the Qasem Soleimani strike in 2020 as well, that caused Iran to pull in its horns for the rest of President Trump's first term.
So, Dan, what do you think? Is Trump going to just walk into Iran, knock over the Ayatollah, I guess install the MEK in power, and have, or the what, son of the Shah, and then just celebrate and have democracy in the Middle East from there on out?
No, they'll put Mariam Rajavi in there, the MEK lady. Let her run the place for a while, the kook. You know, I try not to use bad words, and I'm not going to use them on your show, Kyle, but when I see Tom Cotton talking, the language that's in my mind formulating right now, it's not pretty. It's not pretty at all. I'll have to go to confession just thinking of, but it's just classic neocon, isn't it? And what's this with the scare quotes on forever wars? Dude, 20 years in Afghanistan is pretty close to a forever war. Why are you laughing? Why are you making it a joke? And the Soleimani assassination was an act of terrorism, and it did not bring stability at all. Iran retaliated, and he must know that, and he's afraid to say anything. Iran retaliated against several U.S. military bases there, sent a very strong message. It could have accelerated, except it was the United States who backed down, who allowed that retaliation to take place against some American bases in Iraq and Syria, and the U.S. did nothing. They backed down, wisely so. So he's talking out of some other place other than his mouth. I won't say what I'm thinking right now, but he's the guy who stole the gold bars from Iraq. So what do you expect? The guy's an awful, evil thug.
Yeah. So, Dan, the last question I have for you today, and one of the only reasons that I'm somewhat not pessimistic that we're going to end up with war in Iran, is that maybe Netanyahu looks at the situation, and for all that he says in public that Iran is making news, that the Ayatollah wants to kill all Jews, he looks at the situation. Iran didn't go to war and start bombing Israel after Hezbollah was beaten back, after Assad was overthrown. He now has southern Lebanon and southern Israel are occupied by Israel. He's on his way to ethnically cleansing not only Gaza, but the West Bank. And right now, the Iranians are doing nothing. And so I have to imagine that somewhere in Tel Aviv, there's conversations happening saying, like, do we really want to take the risk of taking a shot at Iran? Maybe we maybe we dispose the Ayatollah and end up with a real lunatic in power, somebody who really does want nukes, somebody who really does want to wipe out Israel. And then we'll have to contend with that, where right now we have what seems like a fairly workable old man in power whose primary concerns are making sure Tehran doesn't get nuked and helping his country make some marginal economic gains by developing ties with Russia, China, and the rest of the global south. I mean, that really does seem to be Iran's priority to me. And I don't know, I'm just wondering your thoughts on that.
If it had been a few years ago, quite a few years ago, I guess, I would have imagined a conversation like that might have taken place in Tel Aviv. But the Israel of today is a very different animal right now. It's out for blood. It's out for ethnic cleansing. It's out for genocide. And I don't think it has any brakes in the car. I mean, Netanyahu is now a moderate. When I was first following Israeli politics in the 90s, he was an extreme right guy. Now he's just kind of a liberal. As to Iran, I mean, I think Iran may have suffered for being too hesitant. There was an opportunity it had to strike back at Israel a few months ago that they didn't take, and it's similar with Russia. There's a lot of concern within Iran that the leadership is being too hesitant to exercise this force, just like the criticism that Putin has been way too cautious The problem with this cautiousness, yes, it's nice, but on the other hand, it emboldens your enemies, especially when your enemies are insane, like the neocons here. And I'm convinced now a lot of the Israelis running things over there. Now, I know that that Colonel McGregor has a high regard for the, he did at least, for some of the top people in the military of Israel. Hopefully there are some people in the military that understand that this is not a good move for them existentially. But that remains a big question.
Yeah. Well, everybody, Daniel McAdams, again, Executive Director of the Ron Paul Institute. Catch him almost every day on the Ron Paul Liberty Report. You guys, I guess now know why I was so excited to talk to Dan today. Also, follow him on Twitter. Yes, he moderates himself a little bit on this show and on the Liberty Report, but he's a real firebrand on Twitter, has some really, really spicy and awesome tweets. At Daniel L. McAdams, correct?
Yes.
All right, and we'll be back with another episode of the Kyle Anselone Show soon. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel.